soldier stuck his knife into the desert sand repeatedly and then buried the holes with his feet. When he plunged into the next sand, he was suddenly confronted by quicksand. But instead of running away, the soldier called out excitedly to his teammates. When everyone arrived, they stood on the pit of quicksand, singing and dancing with joy, because where there was quicksand, there might be water down there. With high hopes, they removed the wooden planks and saw a deep well that could not be seen from the bottom. They thought the water would be at the bottom, but when the captain threw a stone, the sound that came back was a muffled sound. Knowing that there is no water, the crowd instantly became extremely desperate. So hard to find the well did not expect to be a dry well. But Paul is still not dead-hearted in the teammates to help him carefully climb to the bottom of the well. The moment he landed on the ground, it is true that all the sand inside Paul was angry instantly on the head. Just when he wanted to return to the ground, but unexpectedly touched a wet wall of the well. So he followed the wall down to find that the stone side of the water is really dripping. Finally found a source of water. Paul was very excited. He rushed to notify the teammates above. The other heard immediately from his pocket out of a metal box and then did not hesitate to throw it down. In order not to waste the precious water, Paul poured the water on his right hand and then used his feet to move the metal box to a position within his reach and then poured the water into the metal box. Knowing that the box would soon be full, he asked his teammates to throw down a few more containers. Once he had the container, he filled it with water and licked up the excess on his hands. It didn't take long for Paul to fill both containers. Then he urged his teammates to be careful. After all, this water was a matter of life and death for the team. Under the captain's expectation, his teammates carefully pulled the rope upward until the box was safely in their hands, and then they were a little less nervous. The captain understands that everyone is very short of water, but in order to make sure that everyone can drink, he can only order everyone to take a sip first. At this moment the soldiers, who hadn't had a drink in days, smiled like hay moisturized by the rain. After all, the water was not easy to come by. Then he passed the water to the next teammate so that all the people present could have a drink, and finally they all had a turn before the captain got it. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them alive in the desert. Paul continued to catch water at the bottom of the well. Even when his teammates wanted to exchange places with him and let him rest on the ground, Paul did not feel the need to do so anyway. The job of catching water was easy, so Paul continued to stay at the bottom of the well. With the water supply, the soldiers were all in high spirits. They wanted to catch more water and continue on their way. But then a German armored car came in from the distance. The captain quickly laid out the tactics for all the men and told them to lie in ambush at predetermined points. When the enemy let down their guard and entered the encirclement, they attacked the Germans. After a heavy firefight, the Germans fled in a panic and didn't have a chance to fight back. Then they managed to capture 2 German soldiers. The captain realized that he had a chance to get some information from them. In order to get the other side of the information, the captain immediately asked his companions to bring drinking water and then poured out a small cup of water and stood in front of the German soldiers to drink a sip. Of this can be the other side of the mouth to see the dryness of the tongue. The captain then acted as if he was very angry and poured out the remaining half a glass of water, which made the German officer thirsty. In order to trap the enemy's plan, the captain asked his men to bring a pot of water and then gulped it down under the eyes of the other side. And then he poured out the remaining water as if he didn't care about it. After the captain's performance, the Germans who had been thirsty for 10 days finally could not bear the temptation and told him everything he knew about the plan. It turned out that he had been sent out to look for water. The total number of troops was 800, but they had not drunk water for half a month and were now coming in this direction. But all the soldiers were so dehydrated that they couldn't even carry a gun, let alone fight. When he learned of this, the captain had a new plan and decided to release the 2 men on condition that they told the Germans that there was water here and that if they wanted to drink it, they would have to give them weapons in exchange. But Paul told the captain that the bottom of the well had completely dried up and no more water could come out of it, and that they would probably die of thirst if they stayed here. But in order to eliminate the enemy in the rear, the captain had to go on because the team was small. So they had to bury a lot of mines to avoid fighting with hundreds of Germans at the same time, and then set up all kinds of anti-personnel machine guns and hide in the corners to wait for the Germans to attack. It didn't take long for the Germans to gather, and their goal was clear: to seize the water. As the Germans slowly approached, they were soon blown up by the mines they had planted, and 9 of them hid in the shadows to sneak up on the Germans, not giving them a chance to fight back. Under the heavy firepower of the Germans, the soldiers were sent scurrying away. After the end of the battle, there is still one unfortunate casualty in the squad. The remaining 8 people are heavy silenced to send off their teammates who died in the war. The Germans had been repulsed for a while, but without water they were sure to come back. Soon after, 2 soldiers with white flags came over to negotiate on behalf of the Germans, and they cheekily warned the captain to lay down his arms and give up the water and the Germans would consider letting you live. But the captain suddenly interrupted the other side because he now had to wonder whether the Germans were crazy about water, just lost the battle and still have the face to ask us to surrender. Seeing the other side of the face of disdain behind the teammates actually in front of him in the desert, bathing in the face of the German army which has not had a few days to drink water, craving bad. But he did not know that the scene he saw was the squad used a blindfold deliberately to show the Germans water to whet their appetites. Perhaps only then they will surrender. Translated with Deep L. Calm, free version. The soldiers were bathing in the desert, but they connected the water to another barrel, And the reason why they made this illusion was to break down the psychological defense of the Germans. Watching the other side continue to waste water, and the officer, who had not drunk water for several days, pursed his lips, but he still warned the other side to surrender and demanded to hand over the water source. In the face of such unreasonable demands, the smart captain simply will not agree to the eventual negotiation because of the German officer's personal problems also broke up. In order to get the water, the chief gathered his troops again, and the Germans went for broke this time, using even more powerful mortars. At the same time, another squad of Germans came up behind them and tried to attack from several sides. Seeing that there was no way back now, the 9-man squad could only fight the Germans to the death. And with the only remaining broken arms and debris, the squad once again broke up the German attack. Looking at the dead and wounded German soldiers, the officer came back to renegotiate, still holding a white flag as before, and walked slowly. During the negotiation, the German officer was still reluctant to surrender and leave the water supply, even though he was in a disadvantageous position. In the face of the German officer's arrogance, Curly was furious and killed the enemy with a single stab. The death of the officer made the Germans more and more frantic. Coupled with a few days without water, the Germans began to die, with the remaining 4 people not only mortar bombing them, but also blew up 2 people in the team. At this time, the captain was furious and ready to prepare all the weapons to fight with the Germans to the death again. In the face of the enemy's attack, he bravely stood on the tanks, but the scene in front of him was shocked. His jaw dropped. It turned out that the German soldiers were dying of thirst and didn't want to fight any longer. They ran over to surrender with their rifles raised. So the captain told the Germans to drink from a dry well, but he didn't realize that there was water in the dry well. The remaining 2 men looked incredulous. Perhaps the mortar had just blown up the well. While the German soldiers were drinking, they captured all their weapons.